The Puritans of Massachusetts were an austere, stern society centered primarily around religion. It was their intense devotion that led them to inflict severe, barbaric punishments upon their own people. One of the most common and damaging punishments was public shaming, prevalent in the area, and Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne, the protagonist and committer of adultery with Reverend Dimmesdale, had to bear the burden of a red letter A and the infamy associated with it. Hester's discrimination as a result of her scandalous affair, however, ultimately caused her to transform into a more virtuous individual. In the Puritan culture, this was not uncommon and was typically in full view of their peers, who would shout demoralizing insults and throw things at the offender. In the case of Hester, the righteous adulteress, an embroidered A in full display was required of her to be worn at all times, so that people would associate her with sin and ignominy. In other cases, the letter might be branded into your hand, either an A for adultery, a T for theft, D for drunkard, R for rogue, or F for forger. Another method of Puritan public embarrassment was the stocks. Stocks were a wooden structure that held both the head and hands while bystanders spectated while harassing the offender through screaming insults and throwing items. Hester experienced this during her time on the scaffold, standing before her peers for hours at a time, while they screamed at her and diminished her socially and psychologically. The ducking stool was another method of punishment utilized by Puritans, and while Hester did not directly experience it, it was a long-standing English medieval punishment that translated into the American colonies. This somewhat uncomfortable water-based torture consisted of a large scale-like device with a chair on one end in which the offender would be placed in. The chair would then be repeatedly dunked into a body of water. These would cause the offender to experience the sensation of drowning. Whipping was used to degrade people by either being whipped or whipping themselves, rarely. Sinful Reverend Dimmesdale, the minister, considered himself a flagrant who continually whipped himself because he was unable to live with himself, because he had not confessed and considered himself sinful. Whipping was used primarily when someone committed a great offense. In Dimmesdale's case, he was considered as an adulterer who would have been whipped for his crimes. However, he punished himself for a crime that he had not yet been convicted of.
In contrast to the barbaric and dated punishments of the Puritans, the modern American justice system seems rather tame. While some of the more torturous methods are defunct, modern America has a more sophisticated infrastructure in order to process criminals, rather than simply shunning them around town. This more sophisticated system of criminal justice and processing is chiefly due to the fact that in modern times there are far more laws to break and crimes to commit. Fines today are the equivalent of public embarrassment or the stocks in Puritan times, as they are typically attributed to petty offenses not grave enough for incarceration. Much like the Puritan system, the severity of the fine varies in accordance with the offense. Fines are in use today primarily for violations involving motor vehicles. Confiscation of basic rights comes mainly as a result of a somewhat serious infraction. Variations of this include losing suffrage as a result of a felony, loss of jury duty and ability to own a firearm, loss of driver's license as a result of multiple infractions, government tracking as a result of probation, and deportation of law-breaking immigrants. The final focus of this study on punishment, and arguably the most severe and universal, is incarceration. It is variable depending on the gravity of the offense. In the United States, the country with the largest prisoner rate in the world, 1% of the adult population is in prison. The American justice system, however, has two sides. One, a simple holding cell for criminals and otherwise for eventual release and a gradual rehabilitation that is sometimes effective over long periods of time. You might argue that the prison system is in fact a storage facility for America's undesirables. However, that is not the case. It is actually typically an effective rehabilitation method. In conclusion, there is a clear distinct contrast between the methods of punishment during the early American developmental era and today. And while we like to think their methods are long gone, they are not entirely finished. Objectively, the puritanical methods of punishment were both physical and psychological torture. However, it has been demonstrated that recently we are not above this conduct by the recent CIA torture scandal. While we like to scoff at their ardent barbarism, we still tend to practice it ourselves, but behind closed doors. Puritan values have, for the most part, been outmoded, replaced almost entirely by more modern and effective practices. However, there are still more minute traces of it in American culture.